It's Kevin with Rogue Deck Builder here with a video discussing the state of Standard. I thought I would throw my hat in the ring since Standard is the talk of the town, at least on the interwebs, and what can be done to fix the state of Standard, especially with the announcement that Standard is going to be lasting 3 years rather than the 2-year rotation that has been around for years. Now, there was a format called Extended when I started playing Magic, which wasn't very popular and did have that 3-year rotation. At least a block lasted another extension for that, and they did sort of support it. People would play the format if Wizards of the Coast did support it, and I think that that's what Wizards needs to realize, that whatever format that they're going to have a road, a path to professional play, people will play at the local level. They just need to have that dream to shoot for, and Wizards of the Coast needs to embrace this and actually do things like regionals or even, store-based store champions that are a little more like there's more on the line. Go back to like these regional PTQs, things that give you that clear path to competitive play in paper, and people will play that format. I think that Pioneer is a good example of this. Pioneer had a hard time really getting going until Wizards of the Coast embraced it as a competitive format with the Pro Tour, and then it took off. Now, mind you, Pioneer did become a lot more healthy with the addition of kind of the power level that came in with these last sets to balance it out with the power level of cards that existed at the start of the Pioneer format. And there now is a plethora, a wide variety of decks that are viable in Pioneer that has done wonders for the format. It actually feels like the early days of Modern, in my opinion. But that's another video for another day. We're discussing Standard here. I don't think that Standard is in the worst shape ever. I think that, there's two ways to analyze, like, what is a bad Standard? Is a bad Standard where one deck dominates, but you still play Magic the Gathering, meaning that like there's interaction and you're playing cards against each other? Or is a worse Standard, which, this is my opinion, was something like Throne of Eldraine, where there might have been more decks that were viable, but all of those decks were uninteractive and just absolutely boring. You're just flipping cards, and you knew from the start of your hand if you were winning or losing that matchup. There wasn't a lot of gameplay back and forth. And in my opinion, that was the worst Standard of all time, was Throne of Eldraine, the Wilderness Reclamations, the Fires of Invention. Those were it was an awful time for Standard, because not only were there dominant decks and just dominant cards, but the gameplay was just absolutely miserable. So I enjoy Standard more because it does feel like you are playing the game. When you have on one end of the spectrum, you have things like the Azori Soldiers that are a hyper-aggressive, tribal-based, all-in deck, and they need to be interacted with or you'll just get run over. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like Mono-White Control that are these real draw-go-based strategies that just wipe the board, have powerful planeswalkers to back them up, and you need to go, basically you can't really go wide. You have to just go, push through them with things like mono red aggro. And then you have the Rakdos Midrange strategies that are trying to be these typical mid-range of just playing key cards they're just curve decks at that point. You want a good 2-drop, 3-drop, some interaction and some finishers, but you do also have this aggressive mid-range strategy that has to be taken care of, or that also can take over the game. So in my opinion, this is like more fun, more interactive than some Standards for sure, but it does get quite old going against the same cards over and over and over again. And that's where this discussion is leading. There are a lot of people thinking that there's going to need some bans, especially since a lot of these cards that are dominant in the format are not rotating. So again, I'm going to throw my hat in the ring, and I actually have some I think some unique ideas about what needs to be banned in the format and what's actually more safe than people think, because there's more to a meta than just what cards are dominating right now, because just the mere fact that certain cards exist mean that other strategies can't be played. And I'm talking about oftentimes like Silver Bullet Sweepers or just particular cards. They're like, look, what is missing here? If you actually look at this, like what color stands out is really missing here. And to me, it's like a mono green, or like the green stompy based strategy is non-existent. And we do have like mono red that works, but there are also a lot of these, like enchantment seems strong, infect or poison actually seems like it could be strong, but those type of not quite as aggressive as soldiers and red, like typically those are the type of decks that can actually compete toe-to-toe with like the aggro-based strategies. You just go a little bit slower in the mid-range and a little bit over the top, and those typically can find homes in metas, but when there are just sweepers or just these heavy control-based decks that can just ruin those days, it forces people to go in these aggro decks that have these extremely aggressive 1s and 2 drops. So even though there might not be a dominating card in like this Rakdos or Grixis midrange that are keeping those type of decks down, there could be something down in this category that are really keeping those down, and I wanted to kind of discuss that, as there's a card that I am going to suggest gets the axe, gets, you know, the hammer gets banned, that is completely keeping those mid-range strategies from being viable. Alrighty, so this discussion was kind of by Saffron Olive puts it out best here. It says, I'm not sure people realize the current standard isn't normal, having a deck make up 35% or even 50% of the meta, depending on how you count, because he's saying that Grixis midrange and Rakdos midrange are the same thing. I agree with him. I mean, Grixis midrange is just adding a Corpse Appraiser versus not going into Corpse Appraiser. That's the big key difference. You add a little bit of control with Make Disappear and some other options with blue, but it's basically the same deck. Rakdos midrange, Grixis midrange, they're the same thing. So it is about 50% of the meta. Typically in standards, when there are decks that are that dominant, something gets banned. And he states that this is what Fire's Invention and Omnoth and decks like Energy in the past, that's when they start to creep up to this meta share, something gets banned. So I agree with him. I think there are some cards that just really stand out as far as power level that are not good for the format, and especially since these are going to be lasting another year, there's only a couple options for Wizards of the Coast. A, they just let the format become stale and let Rakdos midrange continue to dominate and dominate and dominate for another entire year, or they power creep. That's their only option. So they bring in some cards that then are so powerful that they actually compete with Rakdos midrange. The problem, though, with this idea is just let me show you this here. And we have a typical Rakdos deck right now in Standard. I mean, the shell is typically the Blood Tithe Harvester, Grave Trash Pressure, Shieldred. These are typically your nuts and bolts of the deck. Some decks actually offer there's other slots in here that are definitely viable. You can go in here, but these are typically the ones that have proven the most. It does have, and then Chandra's Hope's Beacon has been a big addition to this because it's just backbreaking if you can copy a Invoke Despair, and this card's just good by itself. There's a lot of value you can have with Chandra. Hope's Beacon, you can tap out for 6 mana, then add the 2 mana and cast something like a Braid, and you can actually copy it. So you can hold up this 6 mana and still get like 4 mana worth of almost has a cascade effect on it. So it does fit nicely in this. And that's really the big change, because Rakdos has been dominant for a while now, but it hasn't been this dominant. But I think there's another card that was printed that is making Rakdos midrange even more dominant. We'll get to that. But anyway, the nuts and bolts of this is definitely some aggressive creature-based strategy that all these need to be taken care of. A 3-2 on turn number 2 is very aggressive. It can win the game in 7 turns at that point if they don't take care of it. And when you're backing up with like control, or tempo, I mean, that's kind of what Delver Secrets did. So this is like a Delver Secrets for 1 more mana, guaranteed flip, can get through if you can protect it and let it go through. But the other cards that almost every Rakdos deck, you can whatever removal package you want to. I mean, there's plenty right now in the format, but it's going to be this Invoke Despair as your big finisher, your Reckoner Bankbuster to draw cards, and you're able to Mirror Breaker to just really, really it finds you mana off of the 2/2 Shaman. It helps you rummage to find exactly what you need, and it then turns into a threat that has to be answered. In fact, that first Goblin, I would even argue is like the real strong part of this deck, because ramping, I mean, keeping back a treasure token is insanely strong in Magic the Gathering. I've stated before, I've hated the treasure mechanic. I think the game was never meant to be balanced with treasures, and now they've added them, in key cards like this Fable the Mirror Breaker. They've just added a treasure token on stuff. These things have really warped the format with the ability to fix mana, ramp, do everything you need to do with that treasure token. There's even decks like Sacrifice where it triggers on Sacrifice or triggers on Artifact dying. They're just crazy powerful. So anyway, that's another discussion for another day about treasures and how much I hate them. I think I've done a video before on them. So again, back to the discussion. If we go back to the Rakdos, if we take it on to the next level and we go into Pioneer, look at this Pioneer list. Shieldred, Graveyard Trespasser, Blood Tithe Harvester, Reckoner Bankbuster, Fable the Mirror Breaker. Okay, same thing. So if it's good enough for Standard, and it's good enough for Pioneer, obviously it's good enough for Standard. And you do get things like Thoughtseize and Fatal Push, but Thoughtseize and Fatal Push are just slightly better than Duress and Cut Down. I mean, they're playing similar roles here. Yes, of course, these two are better. They're much more versatile, but you can still I would say you could run this standard deck and still do quite well in the Pioneer format, just with the rests and the cut downs. And then we go on to, here I even have a modern deck, where you still have Blood Dive Harvester, Fable the Mirrorbreaker. So now this combo is good enough for modern. This is a really, really powerful combination that can compete with just all of the shenanigans and all the power level of modern. Obviously, it's probably too good for standard. So the only option that they can do besides banning is if they were to print in cards that could somehow be on a power level of their own to compete with this sort of strategy. And I don't think that anybody wants that. In fact, we're probably about time for a power reset to stop all the power creep from happening, because that's inevitably what has to happen. In card games is you have to have that power reset. Otherwise, you're just going to have to eventually print cards for 2 mana that win the game. So no one wants that. People want to play at least games that last a turn 5, 6, 7. That's typically where we like. That's the kind of the sweet spot for Magic the Gathering. You don't want things to be incredibly grindy, but at the same point, you don't want things to be ending or have these threats that must be answered or they'll own the game without any sort of interaction whatsoever. Alrighty, so again, back to the Goldfish data here. So first of all, I'll take it with a grain of salt with Goldfish. I have a little bit of problems with how Goldfish gets its numbers, because it used to be a good job of scraping like MTGO and larger tournaments, but unfortunately with Wizards of the Coast hiding a lot of the data from MTGO, there hasn't been the best way to scrape it forward. And Goldfish 2 has some weird places they actually pick some data points from, like this 1-0 Grixis midrange from the counting here for what? I mean, this is going into the meta share here, I believe, of how they do it. So all of a sudden there's this Grixis midrange that, how'd it go 1-0? So anyway, that's what I'm just saying. We take Goldfish's data with a grain of salt. You can get some secondary opinions with going over here with something like mtgmeta.io, which I think is a great way. They track a lot of data from Arena and some other places, and there's even places like MTG Top 8 where you can actually look at other places to kind of get your information. So we're going to actually be looking at this tier list quite a bit for MTG Meta.io to see what decks are performing well and their win percentages, and you can also see some big holes in some of the strategies that I can show that maybe this deck isn't as dominant, like Grixis midrange with only 51% win rate, or the Rakdos Midrange with 53% win rate. That's not the greatest here. That's not that's not usually where they get to the point where we have to ban a card. But the problem with Rakdos Midrange is just you never have to sit down, and that's why people play it in Modern and Pioneer as well. You never have to sit down a matchup and be like, I just have a bad matchup here. Because it has all the pieces you need to compete against everything. You have Disruption, you have aggressive cards, you have kind of silver bullets, and then you have just some of the most powerful cards in those slots. And so, again, it might not be the best at beating any deck. You have these hugely favorable matchups of 9-1, but it doesn't have a bad matchup against anything. And I think that in a card game, you need to have counters. You need to have any game. You even look at things like League of Legends or Dota. There will be a counter to a particular character, and that's what makes the rock paper scissors formats, or that if you even have more than rock paper scissors, much more enjoyable. Is when there are things that just that's what forms a meta, is when a dominant deck gets big, typically you should have some sort of counter. And Rakdos Midrange did suffer from some of those in the past. Mono White Midrange did quite well against them because you could just outvalue them with tokens. And it just seems with some of that's the kind of the problem with Rakdos Midrange right now too, is they have so much toolbox available. If we go over to some of these sideboards for Rakdos, you can see that they have now things like Listening Deluge that does really well against the wedding announcement decks. And you do have just a lot of other things. Even bring in Duress, more Duresses, the ability to do Duress, and a lot of graveyard disruption, a lot of ways to, with the Lithomatic Barrage now too. This is insanely good against the mono blue matchup that typically was pretty easy actually, but now it just puts the nail in the coffin for mono blue and soldiers to have this extremely strong removal spell that just takes care of anything. And now they just have everything at their disposal for the Rakdos midrange deck. So all in all, yeah, the win percentages aren't that crazy for a lot of these decks. However, it is starting to lean towards the all roads lead to going to like Rakdos or this other problematic card that is coming up and really starting to dominate. I think this standard challenge is really puts it home here when it showcases that 4 of the top 8 decks that beat out all of the Rakdos and midrange. So Rakdos midrange lost them all in the semi or in the top 8 to these Naya ramps. And what does Naya ramp have that I think is the first card that I want to talk about that is probably just too good for the format? It's Attraxa. So Attraxa is another problematic card, and we can actually look at good old Attraxa here that has just too many keywords that, unfortunately, this is how they've had to balance Magic the Gathering with these 7 drops. They've toned down reanimation a bit, but reanimation is still pretty good. You have some good reanimation cards right now in Standard for like 5 mana that can cheat out Attraxas, and then with a little bit of ramp, you can get out even quicker. But what they've made with Attraxa with having a really good mana base too is you can run like this half-C ramp / reanimation and still just either rely on casting Attraxa or just reanimating it. And a 7/7 for 7 mana, like the problem with this card is this just blanks any sort of mid-range strategy. So if you are, as I mentioned before, like we're not seeing any of those stompy based decks or even Gruul based decks that typically want to go over the top of like tribals or aggro decks. They're really not getting going till like turn 3, turn 4, where they really get the gears going and the synergies going. Attraxa you're not going to be quick enough to race an Attraxa, and once Attraxa's out, it's just really rough to deal with. The flying, vigilance, death touch, lifelink for a 7/7, and it enters the battlefield over the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card type in your hand. But we all know how it works. You fill back up your hand. The typical mid-range type strategies, especially if they're like more synergy or value-based strategy, this is just too much value to overcome. If you take care of Attraxa, now you have all the cards they've refilled, and it's just a non-win situation. So I think that with this card entering the format, it's basically solidified that can't be a strategy now in Standard. With ramp is super good too. We have a lot of good ramp cards, as you can kind of see with the Naya ramp. So Attraxa came out the gates first of just being included in Rakdos midrange decks, and they're running the Dragon that when it dies it creates the treasures, or you can once again rely on things like Reckoner Bankbuster that leaves back a treasure token, or the Fable the Mirror Breaker that also leaves back the treasure token, to actually even cast these other colors. You're like, wait, I'm in Rakdos. That's 3 colors that aren't in Rakdos. Well, with everything just leaving back treasure tokens, it's actually quite easy to find enough treasure tokens and cast Attraxa. And that's a discounted price too. You don't even have to be at the 7 lands to cast it. And then you fill back up your hand. You have this Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink, which again is going to take over the game in 3 turns if it is allowed to hit. And Vigilance is massive. A lot of people in Pioneer have realized that like Niv Mizzet is just like all the Niv Mizzet decks that used to exist for this sort of strategy of filling back up your hand after casting him Niv Mizzet is just inferior to Attraxa, mainly for the bigger body. But the vigilance and lifelink is the key issue, because it just wins you those games where the board state might be a little bit, like aggro decks could still push their Niv Mizzet. Oh, cool, you fill back up your hand, now I'm just going to push through. You really can't push through reliably on Attraxa. So I think the first one that I would just get rid of that is just too good for Standard is Attraxa. This card is seeing play in Modern. It's seeing play in Pioneer. There's a whole Neoform deck. It does utilize a quicker way of cheating it out. But in a grindy-based format, which we're in right now, this card is just absolutely backbreaking. Sure, you can run like a control shell with counter spells. Sure, you might be able to like pick up a card that takes control of it and hits them with their own Attraxa. Those aren't reliable against the other decks like Rakdos or like Mono or Soldiers or all these other threats you have to do. And Attraxa is just going to continue to push things from being played in the format. So I think this is just a big duck card that is on a power level that is way too powerful for Standard. And they could ban a lot of cards, like completely neuter Rakdos midrange, completely get rid of like something out of Soldiers, completely get rid of some of these control cards that might be extremely problematic or extremely and I'll be talking about one here in a second here. But this card to me is just it's a glaring problem, the since it's being printed, that eventually people were able to find a home of where this card is busted in Standard, and they found it, and now it is dominating. And this last Standard challenge has basically just proven that. And the standard challenge right before that, with a 3rd to 6th place finish too, is just showing that this deck is probably the best one right now against the stretch of the meta, where it's great against like the Rakdos decks and come back from even some of the best draws there and can just outpace even these aggro decks and completely keeping down any sort of mid-range based strategy. So that's the first one. If we go back to standard 2, we can see what else is kind of competing right now. These mono white decks, I know there's a lot of complaints for them, so let's just actually pick up a mono white, and I'll show you the card that I think is actually the problematic card in this one. So all of these mono white decks, they have a few different ways they can finish the game through either Wandering Emperor and the Eternal Wanderer, Planeswalkers that create more value, typical way, and they're running a lot of the cards. There's different ways to build it. You can go like the Sarah Paragon, you can go the Dragon that gets value back after it dies. You can go, things like Spirited Companion and Bishop's Farm. They actually have a ton of cards in this slot that they can do. You can go like Wedding Announcements. Yeah, this one does run Wedding Announcements, but typically a lot of these enchantments, Ossification, they have a lot of good removal in the form of like lay down arms. These type of cards are great. The problem about this deck too, if you actually look at the win-loss rating, if you want it to beat Rakdos, you leave huge holes in your ability to like actually even beat these aggressive strategies or even beat like the Attraxa at that point. So it's kind of a losing scenario right now for mono white. However, there is one card in the mono white that I think doesn't really they'd have to find a different way to play this deck. They'd have to go all in on one end of the spectrum, either really getting that synergy with like the Sarah Paragons, or really going the control based route to then set up the Eternal Wanderer or the Wandering Emperor. And the card is Reckoner Bankbuster. And again, this card just does everything, and there's a reason why it's being played in both Modern and also in Pioneer. So the Reckoner's Bankbuster is definitely the other card that I think is extremely problematic in the format, because it just does too much for a 2-mana spell. There's very little downside to casting this. There are a lot of decks too that don't really have much to do on turn 2, and this is just the perfect card. It's good against aggro, because if you can crew it, if you do have something that can crew it, like in the mono white deck, 2 cards to crew it's fine. In the Rakdos, you just have a natural pair with your Blood-Tithe Harvester, and it's just going to blank a lot of things. And if you have to trade with it, no big deal. You just spent 2 mana. 2 mana for the 4/4. It dodges sweepers. Then you can crew later on, and it's going to eventually draw you 3 cards. This card is very similar to things like Smuggler's Copter, where it's just like, might as well throw in any shell. I can throw in aggro and justify it because it can actually be, a beater. Again, if you cast on turn number 2 and then cast a 3-drop and then crew it, coming in for 4 on turn number 3 is not that terrible. And then the ability to then just continue to draw cards, leave back a treasure token, which then makes things like Attraxa and these other ones that are hard to cast actually, you've ramped into it now, and actually leave back even a 1/1 pilot is insane value off of 1 card. It's often a 3 or a 4 for 1 for 2 mana. You have to deal with this stupid thing. It's not vulnerable to a lot of removal spells. I mean, you do have a Braid and stuff like that, but it feels so bad to run a outer removal spell on Reckoner Bankbuster, and it's just going to grind out the game. It's going to, help fix the deck in multiple ways, and this card is just the perfect card now, and you can see so many decks utilizing this. And I think that the format would become more diverse just if you got rid of Reckoner Bankbuster, because it does, as I said, it can go in every deck. That doesn't mean it's just not better in some decks. And the decks that can really utilize it, like this mono white and the Grixis or the Mardu Midrange, they even have a 1-up on the other ones because it's a lot easier to crew. It fits in their 2-drop slot a lot better. And it's just, in this one, again, it kind of dodges if you go into like sweepers where you're exiling it, you still get your Reckoner Bankbusters stick around, and then you can eventually get the last charge counter off of it and start beating down with them. This is just a card that I think is just way too powerful right now in the format and keeping a lot of things from, like, again, it really feels like in Standard, if you cannot utilize Reckoner Bankbuster, if it's just like a weird slot, going back to those stompy decks, going back to kind of these mid-range synergy decks that might want to go a different route, then you're just at a massive disadvantage than the decks that can utilize the Reckoner Bankbuster. Alrighty, so if we take kind of a look back at the meta again, we do have a card that is not really in the mono white mid-range. I'm not even sure if it's showing up in here. I'm just going to get the cat out of the bag, because I just think that eventually this card is going to be problematic, and this is Farewell. Like, I do not like the design of this card, and people might just laugh at me. Oh, farewell! It doesn't see a lot of play. I did find some lists of these control shells of running the Bankbuster that do run farewells and then run a bunch in the sideboard. But this is the issue with like the mono whites and some of the Esper decks and stuff, is they have access to farewells in the sideboard that absolutely just crap on any sort of mid-range strategy. If you can't race a farewell, if you're going like enchantments or artifacts route, or you have any sort of reanimation graveyard, if you like, this card just does so much. It's just such a silver bullet card that it's going to take a lot of work for some of these mid-range strategies to ever be able to compete with an environment where farewell exists. It's another card that I think was designed for Commander in mind rather than in Standard in mind. It does even see play in formats like Pioneer, and I don't know if I've seen it in a Modern list, but I think that this could easily be justifiable in something like that, and is just a silver. I do not like silver bullets. I like cards not being able to answer everything. I want like one little hole, and people are like, okay, well, farewell can't, take care of planeswalkers. Yeah, well, that's why you run a planeswalker deck with it. But I mean, it's just a card, once again, that doesn't really put up the numbers at the moment, but is always there from deterring people from building decks that can't compete against farewell. And from a brewer's perspective myself, this is something that I've always run into. Oh, can I build this deck? Oh, farewell will just destroy it. So it's a card that I think eventually, especially now it's going to last another year in Standard, will be a problematic card. So you might as well just nip in the bud right now before it does cause problems in the future. Back to the Standard meta. Now we're going to get out the cat out of the bag. There is one card that everyone knows is just absolutely broken and is on a power level of its own, seen play all the way in Legacy, which is going to be Fable the Mirror Breaker. If we go back to all of these lists, I'm actually surprised these Naya Ramps actually don't use Fable. I've seen them in the Naya Ramps ones. So, but all of these Rakdos Midrange lists, there are so many aggro decks lists, all the Pioneer decks. In fact, I actually think this card should be banned in Pioneer because it's just so insanely strong. Fable the Mirror Breaker is backbreaking. And it's one of those cards that's like, okay, well, it's not that big of a deal, Kevin. You just remove the Goblin, remove the Kiki Jiki, and you're fine. Yeah, you just had to 2-for-1 yourself. This card is just feels so bad to run out any removal, because it's not like the most insane threat ever. The problem is it just does everything. This is a game of variance. This is a game of like wanting to get the right cards. Right? Like there's so many games that are decided on mana screw, like mana fixing and card draw of finding the right cards. Fable the Mirror Breaker fixes both of those. And this is just one of those cards that you start, like any deck that run reds, you're like, oh man, I'd rather just have a Fable the Mirror Breaker in this spot than any other 3-drop. Because it can be incredibly aggressive. I've seen red aggro decks run this. But when I'm brewing in Pioneer, there are so many decks if I'm like in like card draw, like if I need anything off of like a card draw trigger, or if I have any sort of thing that even relies on like enchantments, or this has 2 creatures for 1. If you need anything in the graveyard, the loot ability is insane. This is one of the better ways to pitch something in the graveyard. This card just does everything, and you can't just slap a word salad on a card and call it good. You need to have a variety of cards that do a variety of things. You just can't have a card. You can't have like this Swiss Army knife that does absolutely everything and expect it not to warp formats. And Fable the Mirror Breaker has been warping Standard around it. It's decks that cannot utilize Fable the Mirror Breaker as efficiently do not see much play. You have a few options here. In fact, these mono white decks, I have seen these mono white decks run Fable the Mirror Breaker a lot of times. What's this Boros Invoke? I'm just going to click this Boros Invoke and see if it actually has. Yep, Fable the Mirror Breaker here. So this is very similar. Here we go. We have the Wandering Emperor in here. It's doing. Oh, it's trying to go Invoke Justice. Never mind. This is a completely different one. But I've seen a lot of these Wedding Announcement red or mono white decks that have splashed for Fable the Mirror Breaker because it is that powerful. It is that powerful of a card, especially if that treasure token gets hit. You get your 5-drop out a turn quicker, or your 6-drop out a turn quicker, and people have to answer it. If it flips in the mono white shell, if we go back to that mono white shell, it's got a lot of cards that then can start. It can. We all know the Blood Tithe Harvester combos is backbreaking, but there's cards in here that copying is massive. To get a copy of even like a Spirited Companion is massive. So it's a card that just makes every other card so much better in the deck. And if Fable the Mirror Breaker ever does flip 2 of them, then you have a 1-mana combo in and of itself, they can just make a bunch of them and go extremely wide. We've all lost games before by two Fabled Mirror Breakers that turn into Kiki Jikis and start copying themselves, and then they just go wild. And you have to have a at that point, it's just 1 mana equals 2 damage, because they end a turn, you make them, and then they get that pseudo haste when you untap and then swing in with them, and it's just a lot of resources again to have to deal with a 3 mana spell. And so that is definitely another card that I think is in contention. This is the card, if I were to pick one card just to try to mix things up, it'd definitely be Fable the Mirror Breaker. There would be some arguments for Reckoner Bankbuster, because it's just, again, another Swiss Army knife tool that the decks that can utilize it just have a huge advantage over the ones that can't, and the decks that can really utilize it have even a bigger advantage over it. And so it's just one of those cards that's like, the format's probably more diverse. There's probably more strategies you could go if this card did not exist. Now, there are a few other cards that people have talked about that definitely are in a parallel of their own. Sheoldred the Apocalypse is one that gets mentioned a lot. The problem with Sheoldred is we've actually even seen Rakdos decks cut it, because it is quite awkward in some matchups when it doesn't do a lot. Like, it doesn't... I mean, it is backbreaking too because of Fable the Mirror Breaker. This is like an answer right now to other Fable decks of draining 4 life when they go to draw their cards. I mean, just this slapping on that ability is what's good with it. Trades with anything. But we've seen where Sheoldred's been cut from decks, and it actually doesn't affect the decks too much. I think it's just like one of these safe ones. People always go back to Sheoldred because like, yeah, I could play this 4-drop, but this Sheoldred probably has a better overall matchup against the whole field. It's backbreaking for aggro. They have to have a way to deal with it, which again, that's key. There are the decks that, like the mono white, they need to be you need to go underneath them before they get going. Sheoldred is just the perfect card against those ones for the Scrixis one, and so I could rationalize, like I still need to do a rant video about Sheoldred because I hate the design of this card. I can't stand where they just keep pushing some of these cards. Like, it shouldn't have been a 4/5 for 4. It should have been something like a 3/4 for 4, and then it'd be susceptible to a lot more of those 4 damage removal spells. Or even at that point, they could slap down a 3/5. It does 1 less damage when it attacks. It has Death Touch. A 3/5 for 4. It's just like all these stats just scream of a push card. I can't stand when they design cards like Questing Beast or Sheoldred where it's like, oh, obviously we want this card to see play, and so we're going to make sure, because not really the ability here, it's going to be we're going to slap on the massive body. Like a 4/5 for 4 is great. It's just a really, really above curve statistic, especially when you slap out those other abilities. I could see the justification for Invoke Despair. This is another card that just makes these mono black and mono red decks just incredibly good, and it's hard to build. Like, if you go into this whole mid-range Rakdos strategy, it's hard to justify going into anything besides Invoke Despair because of exactly what it does. And it is just backbreaking too when they, a lot of matchups come down to who draws the most Invoke Despairs. Yeah, but again, I don't think that this card is necessarily what is making these Rakdos decks viable. You could run a lot of other spells here, like go into Jund, and then you have like the 7 mana damage spell that also can destroy something if it has additional damage. Those type of spells you could justify running in the slot, and I think the decks would still be quite viable. So I don't think that it's ban-worthy. I don't think either Sheoldred or Invoke Despair are necessarily the cards that will if you were to ban them in Rakdos, for example, I think they just find another replacement, and the decks would be completely fine. We still see the exact same amount of numbers. So there you have it for my list of cards that I think would be good for banning. I'd be interested in your comments in the comment section below of what you think would be good bannings. There are, like, again, going back to Standard, I don't feel as horribly about it because you can still be successful with a plethora of other decks. I've seen, like, green-white enchantments do good. Some infect or some poison decks do pretty good. You can go a lot of tempo-based strategies with like green and blue-based decks I've seen perform well, and I'm sure I'm going to hear every F&M hero tell me about how they have such a great Rakdos matchup, and they're not worried about Fable the Mirror Breaker and Reckoner Bankbuster. Oh yeah, sure. I mean, and we're going to hear those stories all the time, but I don't know. The proof is in the pudding at this point. These cards, Fable the Mirror Breaker, Reckoner Bankbuster especially, they are just on a different level of being these Swiss Army knives that are just insanely powerful, and you just can't justify not including them in decks. And now what we're seeing, as I reiterate this point again, is decks that can utilize these cards better than others are the ones that are, winning. And then we have, of course, Attraxa, which I think is gonna continue to be a problem. And the more cards entered into Standard, now that we have a bigger pool, this card is going to continue to be a problem. And it's just something that I think the format's a lot healthier without it. And Farewell. It's just a bad design card. It's just a one-trick pony, or a one card answers all. That if we get some really powerful, earlier control cards, or like a powerful Planeswalker in the 3-drop slot, this is gonna be a problem. At that point, it's just gonna be farewell, farewell to other decks farewell to mid-range decks, because this card is just gonna continue to push them down. Again, I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know in your comment section below. And if you'd like to see some Pioneer brews, I'll have them in the cards here. Go ahead and click on a Pioneer brew and give me a comment for a Pioneer brew that maybe you'd like to see. This has been Kevin with the Rogue Deck Builder. Thanks for watching.